No problem.
Okay. Cool. Do you want to kick off?
Yeah, so welcome to the July 13 meeting of the CNCF IoT Edge working group. On the agenda today, we have one item, which is to talk about a new white paper that we're planning to kick off. I guess in some sense, it already is kicked off because there is an early stage draft already in existence. And the goal was to cover things related to running workloads out at edge locations. There's a shell of the scope in that draft document, but I think at this stage, we're still potentially open to modifying the scope a bit too. And we had a plan to conduct advancement of that draft doc up until a future publication, both by discussions in meetings and asynchronous comment and edits of the shared document. I don't have the link to the document readily available, but if somebody could post that in the chat, that probably is useful for Brian. And then that's on the agenda. And as usual, sometimes this group has meetings where literally nothing is on the agenda, but we still tend to have the meeting anyway and just conduct free-form birds of a feather discussion about, any questions users might have or cool things they've seen, whatever, as long as it fits in the category of Edge or IoT, it's fair game. The other thing I'll point out is a few years ago, we did take on a white paper, and I think it largely addressed security issues when dealing with Edge. So we've kind of been through this before, but like many things in tech, these sorts of things get sell-by dates where you wait a couple years and maybe half the document is more dangerous than useful in terms of how the world has moved on. So I think we'll aspire to making this white paper a maintained document that isn't a one-shot. Sometimes those aspirational goals aren't held up. I don't think we really spent the time to go out and revalidate the last white paper we did, but perhaps we can do better this time.
Yeah, definitely. So, Brian, I don't know if you read already the outline, but I think the main idea is to try to specify all the superset of requirements for the workloads to be able, on top of what we refer to cloud native principles in terms of what they need to what we need of them to be able to run it on the edge. I don't know from what kind of edge are you coming from and what's your interest? So maybe you could give your view of the edge and the edge workloads.
Sure, yeah, and I have not read the outline yet because I had a conflict for this meeting, but that one dropped, so that's why I joined this one instead. So I will review that paper and that outline. But yeah, I've been working on Edge stuff for many years now. And just to give you guys a heads up too, I'm doing Google Summer of Code mentoring for 3 contributors, and we're doing analytics workloads at the edge. I'm teaching them how to do that on top of Kubernetes and stuff. And we're basically just creating open source workloads for specific verticals, just as an example, not that they're the perfect example or not that they're the perfect thing, but just to show how to do that so that people go, oh, okay, that can be done.
That sounds really cool. I'd like to see that as it advances, if what you're doing is being done in open source and shared.
Yep, and I'll put the link to the Google Summer of Code in the chat.
Yeah, so far in the white paper, this was initially proposed by a group of people that I don't know if this is their personal description, but I describe them as largely telco focused. But at Edge, we tend to have people coming, that's certainly a key group that's interested in Edge. But there are definitely others, and the use cases for telco versus, say, industrial IoT, gaming. Uh, there's a class of analytics for analyzing uh, image recognition coming from camera feeds, and kind of all these niches tend to be a little bit different. I think another one I see a lot out there is kind of retail edge, where people are landing things out at edge to support various forms of stores, from large ones that might have multiple Kubernetes cluster nodes to very small ones that maybe are resource challenged to the point where they have difficulty even standing up Kubernetes at all versus just a container runtime.
Yeah, and if you look at that link for the Google Summer of Code, you kind of went across the list of the verticals and stuff. And right now, the three of them that I have contributor-wise, one of them is working in the healthcare space, doing the classic image inferencing of X-rays and stuff like that. And I'm teaching them how to do the data pipeline. We have one guy that's working in the smart traffic space to just look at, webcams and kind of come up with the right thing to do from a stoplight perspective or a travel perspective or whatever. And then one of the other guys is working on the finance space as well.
Are all of these based on machine learning in some sense to do the analytics?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, what I typically do is I give them examples like from Kaggle to go use that one as your first example and then make it better. And then make it, so that you can deploy it on any number of Kubernetes clusters wherever they're at.
Yeah, I just saw an interesting presentation yesterday on advances being made for integrated circuits to assist in machine learning applications out at Edge. And it was kind of interesting. It went into the premise that kind of the generation one was simply applying GPUs that were really not made for machine learning, but worked out much better than just using generic CPUs, to people doing things like Google's TensorFlow optimized hardware, to now a trend of vendors coming up with dedicated hardware that takes into account unique characteristics found at Edge, like power and cost constraints. So I think that field is kind of on the cusp of a big transition potentially.
Yeah, and it's funny you brought up the TensorFlow thing, because that was one of the things I was working with on these contributors too. The ones that were out there were using GPUs, and I said, no, I want you to be able to just do it on a CPU as well. You want to be able to do both. And they figured out how to do that and stuff.
I mean, I think that kind of goes along with how, with the white paper, we were talking about how you would have maybe one paper that's focused on kind of these core principles, and then we could have breakout papers that then focus on different areas of focus on the edge. And I think there is a potential for like a future white paper to kind of focus on what does machine learning mean for the edge, and what does it mean to make your machine learning application portable to the edge, and kind of having that be like a separate area of focus.
Yep, good call out. And that's actually what we're doing with this project, is I'm writing an enterprise architecture thing about edge, analytics at the edge and stuff like that, which is the why you want to go down this path. And then we were going to publish those papers like solution stacks for each one of the verticals, saying, here's an example of how you can do that.
And is this all a part of the Open Summer of Code, or is this a separate kind of I guess, project that you're pursuing? And would this all be public? Because that would be great information to reference from the white paper as well.
Yeah, so that was the goal of the Google Summer of Code, at least to do those solution stacks all publicly visible. And I'm going to ask them to do it on, a GitHub repo and stuff like that. And I'm going to teach them how to use, some open source documentation tools and stuff too. So.
Cool. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you're more than welcome to share all your progress and results here with the group.
Sure. Yeah, and just to give you guys a clue, I mean, we do, in the Google Summer of Code, there's basically 3 phases. There's the one about, learning about stuff up front. Then there's a first coding phase and a second coding phase. And every time we do 2 meetings per week sprint-wise. And then I tell them at the end of this sprint, I want them to do a lightning talk, like a 5-minute recording. And they're doing that. We haven't publicly published those yet, but I'm going to put those out there with blog postings at the end of the next phase.
So I just dropped a link in the chat that is a video recording of that presentation on the AI assist chips for Edge.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
I think if one question that I had with the white paper, if we're interested in discussing it a bit, is I think one assumption we made kind of out of the top is that edge native, whatever that coin term would be, is a superset of cloud native. And I'm curious if you all can think of any cloud native principles that wouldn't pertain to the edge and whether we would have kind of an exception clause there.
I can think of, I think the biggest elephant in the room that's been coming up in this group for years is that the cloud native started with this premise of these large public clouds where they had I don't know if I'd call it a goal or just something that fell out of it, but what was going on was that they would centralize resources into a big pool and maximize the efficiency of this pool of servers, to cut costs and, optimize efficiency. And when you look at Edge, it's kind of the polar opposite of that centralization going on. You don't really have this pool of resources where workloads don't really care which one they run on, that you can direct them to this big pool and share them around. If your compute resource gets split up to thousands of locations, and maybe those locations have very dedicated IO devices on them, that is a really different animal than what you've got in the traditional cloud native public cloud data center. So I don't know if I'm not sure the official CNCF cloud native definition called that out, but there was an original cloud description that came out of NIST that defined the cloud as a situation where things were, on a short-term level, infinitely scalable, that you could get resources on demand and count on it being there. And that was really an effect of having this massive pool. They also made a declaration in the NIST definition that, over a longer term period, you could add resources to the pool. Like if the cloud was oversubscribed, the vendor of that cloud could start buying more servers and building it out to scale up resources. At Edge, once again, that is a little bit more difficult where, if one of these locations is capacity constrained and the workload really has to be at that location to be useful. A common scenario, if the reason you're landing at Edge is latency or data governance issues where really you don't want the information at that location going much farther than that destination itself, you might not have this situation where you can view the compute resource as elastic.
I think as from the point of view of the workload, I mean, that it boils down to that you know, that auto scaling is not there, right? So
Yeah.
so you need to be very careful of the resources for your workload and how you're going to scale it up and down.
And lest anybody thinks that that's such a big change that cloud native doesn't even apply. The one thing that does is, I think the key principle of cloud native is that a properly written app should work the same everywhere. It shouldn't be able to tell, you know, where it is, what hardware it's in, on, etc. And even if the edge jobs are very location centric, it doesn't mean that there aren't advantages to an abstraction layer that would cover up differences from the actual underlying compute resource at one location versus another. You know, I think it's fair to say that the hardware life cycles at edge tend to be much longer than the ones in data centers. I think data center operators are okay with obsoleting hardware on life cycles of 3 to 5 years, but edge, where there's costs of landing and installing that, certainly in factory automation, life cycles of 10 to 20 years aren't uncommon at all. And it means that if you're a big multinational with thousands of these locations, you shouldn't have an expectation that every location installed over a decade has identical hardware. So a cloud native for edge that offered an abstraction to cover up differences between what you find at one versus another when you're trying to shoot the same workload out to 1,000 locations would be immensely valuable.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing to distinguish between something that abstracts away that detail from the application and then the application itself being built for the edge. And kind of in the white paper, we're talking about edge native applications, but I think there is, when we started discussing it, is like, is this about the infrastructure? Or is this about the application? And if you build out kind of an extended orchestration system that abstracts away all that details, that's also a different approach. That's also interesting.
Yeah. As you bring this up, my gut feel is, you know, we could start this white paper with the assumption that people already are aware of what the traditional cloud native definition is. And we just described the delta, but my thinking, just seat of the pants thinking about it right now, is that I don't think that's as useful potentially to an audience, because some of these people might not be familiar with that traditional CNCF cloud native definition. So doing this as a delta from that, it's interesting to some, but not to the entire audience. So I think maybe we could have an intro in the white paper saying, you know, there are some key differences, and this is part of the explanation as to why we even need this white paper, that, you know, this is a realm where clearly some things are different, and part of the mission statement is different when you're going out at edge to justify why this white paper exists. But then as we go on into the content, I think we should drop describing things as, you know, kind of a delta to the original that came before, and do it as something that stands on its own 2 feet, as, you know, best practices for these abstraction layers, what value you get out of it, how you should operate at edge, etc. And in the long term, I mean, there are people forecasting that these edge clouds could be bigger than the centralized public clouds ultimately. And I don't think it's outlandish. It remains to be seen whether that comes about. But as a what if in 5 to 10 years, the amount of compute out at edge is actually bigger than the centralized ones? It would seem silly at that point that this document is worded as a reference to the, you know, to the smaller player out there.
Yeah, I think there is a balance there. there's always a jumping off point. And I think cloud native was a big shift that edge native is going to jump off of, because that's just the way things evolve. So I think referencing back to it isn't a bad idea, but I do understand what you're saying of it's assumed starting point that some people reading it might not have. So I do think, yeah, in the first paragraph, regardless, like addressing cloud native and addressing how we've evolved from there. And then whether or not we assume that cloud native principles apply is the next question, because I honestly don't know what is the established document on what cloud native principles are. Brandon linked to one that Google wrote that had like 5 principles. And then there's another one that's like an open source working document of principles. But I think we quickly call out, like in a couple sentences, is this is what we assume cloud native applications are, like microservice approach, portability, stuff like that. And then talk about, okay, all of those still apply, or this one doesn't, and then move on. But making sure we're defining what we're building off of is important.
And I think our original thoughts about this just being a superset, the more I think about it, it's not a superset as we talk right now, right? It's more of a delta, right? Some things no longer holds, and there are new things that we should be aware of, right? So it's not just a simple superset of the cloud native principles for the edge.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is that developers and organizations want it to be a superset. It seems like they want their same cloud native applications to be portable to the edge, and they're asking, how do I take this and move it to the edge? And so from that logic, it's a superset, because if you're just pasting something onto a pre-existing application to make it edge ready, I can see that as a superset. So maybe there's this like 2 options. You can make like this pure from the start edge native application, or maybe there's some super glue you add to your cloud native application that makes it edge native. And I think the latter one is something that people are interested in, because they don't want to be tied to one region of compute. So that might also be something to call out, of like how maybe we're just addressing the latter scenario, an application that is portable from cloud to edge, or maybe we're focusing on what is like the perfect edge focused application.
Yeah, makes sense. But even addressing the applications that are, some services will be cloud only, some services will be deployed to the edge, right? So taking like a holistic approach to the whole architecture, right?
Yeah, I just posted a link in the chat to the NIST definition, which is a little dated, but looking at that, I just opened that doc and looked at the header of essential characteristics, and actually the rapid elasticity is what they call that ability to scale up your work, have something where your workloads could scale up coming out of a pooled resource, is not the only thing in there. They defined as an essential characteristic on-demand self-service. I'm not sure how much that applies to edge. The one that is still clearly there is broad network access. So I think this aspect that there is network management and governance going on definitely applies at edge. And another thing they put there was measured service. And I think this idea was along the lines that it would be multi-tenant. Some of these edge clouds might indeed have that as an aspect. If a telco goes into the business of hosting multi-tenant hosting as a commercial service at edge, you obviously would need to measure it. If you're doing it for yourself, I'm not so sure that it might be a desirable characteristic, but essential, I'm not so sure.
I think the network one's actually interesting, because I wouldn't necessarily say network access is a given on the edge. I would say the delta of that principle is some network access periodically is important, so that you can kind of have your centralized source of truth. But I think that's an interesting example of like in the cloud, continuous network access is assumed. On the edge, the delta is it's intermittent, and we need to be prepared for that, or maybe it's fully disconnected. So, oh, you're muted, Steve.
Yeah, you're right. And clearly, I think network doesn't mean public internet. It could be essentially kind of call it, it's still air gapped, meaning air gapped from the internet, but there is at least a localized pool of things that are communicating with each other. I mean, kind of if you had no way to centrally manage and update, do policy, you couldn't do these nodes at scale. You know, I'll grant that the intermittent connection is good, but I'd say that if you deployed it once, never had it talk to any other location ever, period, that maybe that doesn't fall into the definition of an edge cloud at all. You know, that's more like you sold some consumer product in a box and got programmed in the factory and is never going to change again. And if you want a different behavior, you need to throw that in the trash can and replace it. And I'd say that that isn't within the scope of an edge cloud.
So maybe that's something we need to define, that edge assumes a central cloud or a control plane.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say the
one.
control plane might not be permanently attached 24/7, but there is some mechanism to have a semblance of control through some means of communication. It could be very intermittent, you know, something like a cruise ship that comes into port once every 3 weeks, but it's still there periodically.
Yeah, but the same principle, same tools that we use to manage workloads in the cloud should be applicable to the edge workloads as well, right?
Mm-hmm. And certainly a lot of the lower level building blocks would be, you know, I think given, unless we're looking so far downstream that we envision WebAssemblies, you know, the building blocks of Docker containers, for example, are very likely to be there in some form. Anyway, it's been an interesting conversation, but now maybe this points out why doing this in the document is something that's going to be essential, because at some point we have to transcribe these ideas into the actual document anyway.
Maybe since there is so many that there's a lot of areas we can consider, is it useful to decide a number of principles that we're going to assign, or is it better to just let that flow and kind of see what we've decided and then cut back from there?
Yeah, I think the opening should have some scope. I mean, just for somebody who discovers this white paper, one of the first things they're going to ask themselves, is this something I'm really interested in? And they do that by reading the first paragraph or the first page. And the document has to clearly identify, you know, what's in the rest of this document. You have to answer that question at the beginning. And as we're drafting the document, we kind of have to answer the question anyway to know, you know, how big our net is for gathering things up that we want to put in this. So I think a good first step is to just begin this by having the outline of what that first page is going to look like in terms of the scope of what we plan to talk about and not talk about. And that should be something we get into before we drill down as a deep dive into the details. I see we've got a few other people who joined late here. So just to fill you in, we're talking about a planned white paper on the subject of application workloads running at edge.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I'm just trying to catch up.
Anyway, to further fill you in, we were talking about how, you know, there have been white papers before on cloud native in general, describing best practices and principles for running cloud native apps in the traditional public and private cloud data centers. But Edge is different. The group had an Edge security white paper a few years ago, but this is more an attempt to do an update and a kind of more broad brushed general coverage of the subject at Edge. Kate, in terms of another way to get started, it might actually be, there are a few white papers covering Edge, but there are more covering cloud. And it might be worth looking at a few of these just to look at what they did for an outline as a model for how to approach, you know, how you go about laying out a document like this.
Yeah, I think a research phase makes sense. There are a couple that are linked in. And it'd be interesting to see some of the other, read around some of the other CNCF white papers, because I think one of the things that Brandon mentioned when he brought this idea to the working group is that the idea of edge native has been thrown around a lot, but no one's really defined what it means. And this working group really is in a good position to define that, given like the CNCF is kind of the hub for cloud computing. And it's now the hub for talking about what edge computing means. So I think looking at what CNCF has defined already in a white paper form, and then also specifically, like you were saying, doing some research into cloud native white papers. And that would also be interesting to get some of those authors maybe to come present. Maybe we can, in some of these explorations and research phase, reach out to people who have been a part of kind of the drafting of other white papers that either if they align with cloud or any edge kind of adjacent technology, that would be interesting to have them come talk through the process of how they narrowed down a list of principles and went about defining that, and just hear if, especially if it's edge related, their input on the paper as well.
Yeah, just figure out what they find useful in the process and whatnot, right? Sounds good. So I'll also try to find a couple of resources on my own. So maybe we can like create a pool and go to them, and maybe by the next meeting get some ideas of how to progress with the outline.
Yeah, and I think the meeting notes or the white paper draft would be good space for that. We could even in the meeting notes just have a section like on, I'll put one year of just research previous CNCF and edge/cloud white papers. And we can add some links here of ones that we've looked at, maybe the name, your name if you're looking at it, and some notes as well there, just to keep the draft clean as well. And for folks who trickled in a little later, the top comment is the link to the working draft for the white paper. If you're interested in getting involved, everyone's invited to join input and producing it. And then in our agenda notes that we base the meeting off of, you can add yourself as an attendee. And let me go ahead and drop the link to that. Great, thanks, Steve. And then here's the for the agenda and attendee notes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hey,
Yeah, I think we've been able to hear you.
Yeah, this is Kevin. I have been working on the Kubernetes project for years, and actually we have some kind of. I just quickly read the beginning part of the paper draft. Yeah, I think we can share some input for the paper. Yeah. For example, the challenge of why we need edge computing and the challenge of adopting cloud native to edge, like that.
yeah, that's cool. I mean, as we said, the original proposers of the current white paper are we think coming from the telco industry. So a point of view from the folks doing IoT
Mhm.
is much appreciated, right? So we have a balanced approach.
Yeah, and actually we do have some discussion in the Kubernetes community, and also reached out the ETSI a few times before to talk about their they have some MEC kind of standard or blueprint or something. Yeah, we have some discussion with them, and we can also share our previous things. Yeah.
Yeah, input from the KubeEdge community would be certainly interesting, given that that was the exact evolution of that approach, is taking Kubernetes as cloud native technology and making it edge optimized. So that'd be really interesting to hear kind of what principles define those architecture decisions could probably be fairly applicable.
Sure.
So I would just say the best place for that input would probably be in the document itself. Feel free to leave comments where you see fit, or add some sections about kind of what you're interested, I would say. And we can make it a asynchronous form of discussion, because like Steve mentioned, it's hard to kind of keep up with all the notes. So yeah, feel free to comment some sources and ideas there.
Yeah, and
Sure.
I think the Slack channel of the working group is a good place to just discuss things as we go, right? It will benefit the whole group and maybe get more people to be involved.
Yeah, and I think the Slack can be a place for discussion too. So for those resources of research, if you find an interesting one, dropping it there, or some comments on scope of white paper.
Cool. So I think we're close to an hour. So do you have some more topics, or what do you think?
I'm good. I think going forward, the action item is maybe try to line up a speaker for the next meeting. And then we'll set aside a little bit of the agenda to talk about the white paper again there, maybe at the tail end of the meeting. We'll give it 5 or 10 minutes.
Thanks for this discussion and for sharing this.
Okay, if there's no last minute ads, I guess we can call this meeting to a close and stop the recording. Thanks everybody for attending, and we'll see you at the next one.
See you in 2 weeks if you're interested in all this.
Bye.
Thanks all. Have a good one.
Take care,
Bye.
everyone.
See everyone in a couple weeks. Bye.